I am super excited about our session today with people that Innovate Educate's worked with for, gosh, maybe 6 or 7 or 8 years. Keith, love the work you've done, Federal Reserve Bank everywhere, but really the specific work that we connected around skills. So I think, for all of you that have participated in close of previous years, you probably kept up with the research that Keith has done. And I will be sending the report out again after this, but we're going to have both Ashley Putnam and Keith Wardrop do separate presentations around their work that they're doing. Ashley, would you say that your Federal Reserve Bank is the main one working on skills, or do you feel like all Federal Reserve banks are? That's my first question.
I do think there's quite a few of us who are talking about this. We have colleagues at the Atlanta Fed that lead the Center for Workforce and Economic Opportunity. I believe that's right. There's CWEO, and they do a lot of work around this topic as well. And then Keith worked with our colleagues at Cleveland Fed on this particular study. So I do think there's a growing interest in this, although I will give Keith credit for being one of the first to really raise the alarm about this important issue.
I agree with that. So we applaud you, Keith, because, I love those early skill adopters. It's my passion. So without further ado, do you guys have do you want to present first, Ashley, or what do you think? I don't
Yeah, I'm going to give some context around all our work, and then that kind of actually leads really perfectly into what Keith's talking about, because it is part and parcel of kind of the same concept. So let me see if I can get my screen up.
And just for housekeeping purposes, thank you all for being here. We have a great group today. Several people said this looks like a great topic. Close-it Distributed is in its final month. And we have had 7 months of incredible presentations, so we'll all be on YouTube, definitely by the end of the month. The final event is on May 26th. We're giving Shift Awards in partnership with SHRM, and we're really excited about that. This will be recorded and is being recorded and will be shared, so we will send that out. So thank you all for being here. We'll leave Ashley and Keith, let's leave about 10 minutes for questions, because I'm sure we'll have some good discussion.
Great. I think we will have plenty of time for questions.
Good.
Based on what Keith and I have lined up. So can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent, great. So just for context, I lead with this, and I'll talk about this a bit. I lead a strategic initiative that came out of the Philadelphia Fed. It's about 3 years old. That's called the Economic Growth and Mobility Project, and really focused on how do we think about creating pathways to economic opportunity and building more inclusive economies. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but before I do, I'm going to do this. I'm sure Keith's going to do it. We are required to say that the views expressed here today are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, the Federal Reserve system. So these are my views alone and do not represent the Fed. These are all fun things that we always get to start a presentation with. So just for some context, I'll talk a little bit more about myself in a little bit, but I came to this work at the bank in large part because I was really interested in why workforce development is an economic imperative and not just something that is, a charity or something that's nice to do. So whenever I give these presentations, I often start out by saying, I'm not an economist and I'm not even a researcher. I get to work with wonderful people like Keith to really understand what the data says and how to utilize that to really create and foster more inclusive economic growth. I did come to this work from workforce development at the City of New York, which is when I first met Jemay. And we were really grappling with how do we get around this hiring for credentials into thinking about skills, and how do we invest in skills, and what skills should we be investing in to build back better for the City of New York. So that kind of informs my policy wonkishness, which you'll see a bit in my presentation and the things we focus on. I often get asked this question as well. So for those of you who are not familiar, usually when I start discussing economic mobility and our strategic work, the first question I get is, why does the Federal Reserve care about this? Why are we focused at all on economic mobility? And the answer is twofold. I think one big piece of it is, of course, we have this dual mandate, which is to think about price stability, which is what most of you are familiar with, but also about maximizing employment. And when we think about maximizing employment, I think we have to have a conversation about the people who are being left out of our economy, both prior to this moment and of course in this recovery. People who may have not a college degree, but have a lot of skills and important assets that they bring to bear in our regions and in our economic growth. So we think about that maximizing employment as being really essential to the work that we do. So I mentioned, I'll talk about this briefly, the Economic Growth and Mobility Project. This is a new initiative. I guess we're 3 years old, so we're a little less new, but it really was informed by, to Jamai's question, some of the work that Keith had been doing, as well as I think some concern what we saw in our Federal Reserve District, which is Philadelphia and many of the areas that we serve in our region are post-industrial economies. They are places where there are high rates of poverty, a large number of individuals without advanced degrees. And we were really concerned about economic growth that is inclusive. And I don't think we are the only Federal Reserve that's concerned about this, but it is definitely informed by issues and trends we saw in our district. So I work on 3 critical issues, and these will come up today: infrastructure, workforce development, and job creation, and really thinking about how to work across all of those things to build more inclusive economic growth. So we really think about local resources, local talents, and local businesses, creating this virtuous cycle for regional economies. So we're going to dig in today on workforce development, but I think what we'll learn from this is that a lot of these things are interconnected and really critical to the strategy that we're working on at the Philly Fed right now, which is about equitable workforce recovery. So that's really the subject of my introduction talk here. And then Keith is going to talk about his very exciting research and how that really ties together. What does it mean to actually do and create an equitable workforce recovery? So this is not shocking to anyone on this call and anybody really honestly who reads the news every day, but we are at a really critical moment for our economy. And there are a lot of forces at play right now, some of which were happening prior to the pandemic, things like increasing income inequality, uncertainty about the future and about jobs, and some of which are a result of this pandemic really amplifying them. So business closures and layoffs. We've seen funding shortages in governments, particularly in local governments, that may have been funding sources for skills development and workforce development. And then, of course, trends around automation and changes in work. And I'll actually share today a little research our colleague Lei Ding did prior to the pandemic, which is, of course, concerning to the moment we are in now. So first and foremost, let's talk very briefly about some of the COVID-19 impacts. Again, many things you've probably heard and see right now, but we know that prior to the pandemic, there were incredible wage disparities around median household earnings, and that those are the households that we are seeing are the most impacted by layoffs and business closures. And so this is something we are concerned about as we look to recovery, is that we save from what we earn. And if you don't have those savings to do income smoothing behaviors, what does that mean for families that are most at risk in this recovery? So this study shows that median household Black households was 41% lower than non-Hispanic white households prior to the pandemic. We also have seen, of course, in the pandemic, disparities in job losses. So Black and Hispanic workers face 1.6 to 2 times the unemployment rates of their white counterparts, as well as women leaving the workforce in unprecedented numbers. And if anyone has seen the April jobs report, we anticipated that was going to be a lot higher number, and we actually saw an uptick in Black unemployment rates in the most recent jobs report. And then, of course, when we look historically at recoveries, we know that the people who are most at risk are often the ones who bear the brunt of our cyclical economic downturns, and this is no different. When we look back to some of the studies that on 2008, 2009, 2010, we saw that Black, Hispanic workers, women, and those without a college degree were slower to regain employment and rebuild assets. And so when we talk about why an equitable workforce recovery, this is really the research reason that we are in this conversation. And yes, I mentioned before, the April jobs report shows we are still missing 8 million jobs from the economy. And so while we are recovering and things are starting to get better, there's a lot of concern about those disparities. And another really big concern about what happens if jobs are not coming back at all. And what do those jobs look like? What are the new jobs that we're going to see when other jobs may not be the same? So that kind of brings me to our research on automation. And I'll just caveat this by saying, this is research we did that our colleague Lei Ding did before the pandemic. He has also done another study that I hope Jamia will share about what we're calling COVID forced acceleration, right? Which is essentially, has the pandemic accelerated some of these trends? And not surprising, but we did find in many ways, yes, some of these trends have accelerated. So I see we have a chat function, so I'm going to do one of my favorite things to do in a presentation. So again, knowing that this is 2018 data, and this is just about Philadelphia, I'm curious what you all think we found were jobs that were most likely to automate. Anyone want to drop in the chat? What do you think? Any guesses? Jobs that are likely to automate. Okay, janitorial jobs I see. Cashiers, yeah. Restaurant services, oh, lawyers. Very interesting. Manufacturing, okay. So this is interesting because a lot of our studies on automation in previous economic moments have really focused on some sort of blue collar middle skills manufacturing jobs. But what we actually found from this study when we looked at, the 95% and above threshold is really what Lei was looking at. Some of those jobs included, let me see, cashiers, not shocking, that was one you all picked on, office clerks, administrative assistants, and bookkeeping and accounting clerks. And so what's also interesting about these jobs is that these are jobs that are often held by people who do not have four-year college degrees, but obviously to be in these jobs have a considerable skill set and actually some really interesting skills that they can bring to the economy if we look at what they could do next. Some things that were a little more surprising and maybe jobs you wouldn't have thought of, landscaping and groundskeeping, that was surprising to me. Billing and posting clerks, shipping, receiving, and traffic clerks, and then maybe not so surprising are tellers. I always say I don't think I've been to a physical bank in the past 3 to 4 years to deposit a check. So maybe not so surprising, but again, we look at these jobs and these are not people who are unskilled in our workforce, but they do tend to be people who do not have four-year college degrees. And so this raises some concerns. These are no longer manufacturing jobs, but these are really jobs that tend to be lower wage and provide less economic security. And I think the other question that this study asked was, well, who holds these jobs? And so we find there that they are lower wage jobs. They tend to be, this is defining lower skill as people with a high school diploma or less. So as opposed to middle skill, which was some form of higher education, but not a bachelor's degree, those are also still jobs that are automating. And of course, the ones that have the least risk of automation and highest projected growth are jobs that are currently requiring a bachelor's degree or higher. So that is something that is obviously a trend that is concerning, but even more concerning was this one, which was who will be most impacted. And what we see here is that these are predominantly jobs held by Black or Latino workers. They are actually more likely to be held by women than men, which is contrary to kind of manufacturing jobs and previous trends in automation. And they're also held a lot by younger workers, right? So these are jobs that young people may get as, a first job, but also older workers. So interesting trends in age. And for us, this trend, particularly around race and gender, means that when we think about who holds jobs like cashiers and bank tellers and administrative assistants, we really need to be thinking about the racial and gender equity component of the future of work. And I think that's in my slide deck. So why focus on equity when we talk about our recovery? The first is to prevent long-term dislocations of these workers, right, which could extend our economic crisis. And also, we really need to talk about some of these systemic inequalities that existed. It's also because if we don't pursue a more equitable recovery, if we don't make that our goal, we could be looking at a proportion of Black, brown, and women workers, as well as those without four-year college degrees, who may suffer long-term dislocation from the workforce and experiencing lasting financial hardships. And then finally, we did a really exciting study, and I'm happy to share this around as well, from the San Francisco Fed. So I say we, and those with a larger sense, it came from our colleagues in San Francisco, about the racial and gender disparity loss to our GDP. And so what these disparities mean for our collective economy. And that is estimated to be $2.6 trillion. So really interesting study conducted in the San Francisco Fed, and we're happy to share that as well. You can imagine what that means to regional economies if we continue these disparities. This isn't just about the people who may not be able to find a job in recovery. This is about collectively what's happening in our economy. And this is about our collective better good. So quick definitions here, because we kind of tossed this around a little bit, and I feel like some people know this, some people don't. But what's the difference between equity and equality? And I'd love to see that in the chat too for folks who are familiar, or guesses. What do you think equity versus equality means, particularly in our labor market? Any thoughts? I guess we will provide a link to that. Any thoughts on equity versus equality? It could be short form, long form. I've got this nice image up here, so I'll talk about it a little bit. But really what we're seeing here, the first image is what we typically call equality, right? So that is everybody gets equal treatment, but we're not acknowledging the systemic inequalities that led us to these disparities in the first place, right? So we've been doing some studies recently around gender and actually the jobs that women held that were predominantly not protected by a lot of wage and benefit, as well as other securities. Right, so some of these disparities are not that old, and some of these things that are impacting workers to then not necessarily be at the same starting point when we give out that kind of equal treatment. Equity in the last one is really thinking, and in the middle one is actually thinking about how do we make sure that the people who are most impacted are centered in our efforts, right? So yes, I like that definition. All means everybody gets the same. Equity is getting what is needed, right? And then the third image is really what we want to focus on and what we want to talk about, which is how do we really reimagine this so that we are removing those barriers in the first place, right? So they said, hey, we know we need a fence because we can't have balls flying out of the baseball park to hit people in the face, but we can actually make this in a way that nobody has to deal with these systemic disparities. We really are removing those barriers that have been existing. So the third image obviously takes a lot of work and some time to get to. So we are really starting with the second image, which is about equity, but I think the third image is really our goal. And I'll talk a little about the work we're doing here to try to move that way. My slides are moving. All right. So we've been kind of grappling with like what's recovery versus equitable recovery, particularly in the workforce development space. How many people on here, I guess you can't raise your hands, but anyone on here went through the recovery in 2008 and 2009? Might be familiar with some of these. What did we do then that we maybe don't want to do now as part of our shifts? But also, what does it mean for us just to shift how we're thinking about this? So the first is, recovery is often this mentality of like, we just have to go back to normal, right? If we just go back to normal, if things open up, everything will be fine, right? And we have to acknowledge when we say that there are a lot of people for whom normal wasn't working already. There are a lot of people who are being left out of our labor market, a lot of people in jobs that even if they paid, we're not paying enough for them to provide for their families. And so really when we say our economy is not working for everyone, what does a new normal look like? That's us thinking about moving towards that final image of addressing those systemic barriers. We also kind of have this mentality from recoveries that, just find a job. Right? As soon as you can find a job, you got laid off in the pandemic, let's find a job, any job, and you'll find a better one later down the line. And what we found from research is that, that's not always the case for a lot of people, and that we should be thinking about how to connect people to those kind of jobs that provide economic mobility and opportunity, which by the way, Keith's research speaks to really well, and I'm excited that you're going to get to hear from him on that topic. The other is kind of, when the economy recovers, everyone's going to be able to reconnect, right? And understanding that is not true because of a lot of other systemic barriers, like wraparound supports, not having access to childcare, not having access to broadband internet, not having access to transportation to get you to and from where your job is located. And finally, that kind of mentality that individuals are responsible for their own training or skill development. Now, while we hold that to be true and think it is really important, we also understand that there's a lot of risks for people in terms of taking time out of the labor force or even getting into some of these more expensive training programs that can lead to really great outcomes. And so we really want to rethink opportunities for building career pathways through partnership, through how people can work together in both public and private sector, as well as individuals, so that we're ensuring that they're getting the best outcome for their dollar and their time, which is really critical. So this is kind of our definition at the Philadelphia Fed. This is something we've been working on, and we'll have some briefs coming out about over the summer. But what do we mean when we say these words, equitable workforce recovery? And what we mean is it is something that acknowledges and examines the root causes of our employment disparities, that targets interventions to the populations that are disproportionately impacted, that removes barriers to work and training and education, that encourages improved job quality and supports for workers as they're going back to work, and that increases access to career pathways that lead to financial stability. And Keith's going to talk a little more about some of that. So what can we do? What can we, listening in today, do to actually make this equitable workforce recovery happen? Some of you may be in workforce development organizations or economic development organizations. Some of you may be in higher ed. Some of you may just be really interested in this topic, knowing folks that Jemay brings to the table. So I want to posit a couple things here, and then I think Keith's going to dig in a little more and share some ideas. So the work that we're doing at the Economic Growth and Mobility Project has been around reducing barriers. And what do we mean by reducing barriers? It means that we have to think about not just work itself or training itself, but the things that impede people from being able to participate in those activities. So we have 2 research and action labs running this year on these topics. And the first is going to be on the digital divide, and the second is on access to childcare. So basically what we know from this is even as we prepare workers for jobs, there are these systemic barriers that perpetuate inequality. Childcare is one I'm going to talk about a little today, which just remains a major barrier to individuals who are looking to get back to work. But the other one we'll be doing some research on, and stay tuned because we have a report coming out in the next couple months, is going to be about broadband access. And that we understand now is not just a luxury good or really useful for watching Netflix, but is actually really critical infrastructure for accessing training and work. I say this as we are all over Zoom and participating in a conference virtually. For those of us who have the privilege and ability to be able to work from home, even we understand how critical that broadband internet access is. And you can imagine for a lot of families, you're dealing with students trying to go to school, job seekers trying to reconnect with work, and people who are looking to get additional training and education. And now all of those activities are occurring virtually. That shift in how we are working is going to make broadband access an even more critical infrastructure for our economic recovery. So before I move on from the barriers, I do want to dig in on why childcare. And I'm sure there's people here today who are listening and also at the same time managing childcare in the background in your home. And you may understand this really acute problem that we are facing right now. We found at the St. Louis Fed did some studies on labor force participation. And I think many of you have been hearing this and reading it in the news. There's a lot of conversation happening now about, is this or is this not a she session? And really looking at women leaving the labor force in higher levels than we have seen historically. And the question is why? And I think there's several answers to that question. But what this study at the St. Louis Fed found, I think, was really interesting. And that's essentially the disparity in people living the labor force that are women with children. And so again, we see women with kids versus women with no kids. Women with kids are much more likely to move the labor force, both in the spring of 2020 and in the fall of 2020. And men versus men with kids and men with no kids. If you look at that fall statistic, I think what we're really seeing is a pandemic that is disproportionately impacting mothers. And I will say the study also found that single mothers were much more likely to be leaving the labor force, and particularly people who did not have a 4-year college degree. And so again, centering why some of this work we're doing around skills and skills-based hiring is so important to make sure that we're reconnecting women to opportunity. But we can't do that alone if we're not going to talk about some of these systemic issues around access to care. The other thing that I found really interesting, this is a study that is from the Boston Consulting Group. So this is not a Federal Reserve study, but we have talked about this a little bit, was just what we found in terms of caregiving surveys from 2020. Now this is conducted globally, so it does not just represent the United States, but I thought really interesting in terms of how the care burden falls on parents, how many people are having to take on additional care work as the care economy has really been struggling. We know that 1 in 4 childcare centers were at risk at one point in the pandemic, and many have closed down and are not reopening. So these statistics, particularly on the hours that families are spending in providing care when there is no childcare or no school, are really critical infrastructure issues that may or may not be influencing whether or not people are able to go back to work. And again, the 15 hours, we find that women on average spend 15 more hours on domestic labor each week. And so again, disproportionately impacting women and disproportionately impacting mothers in both the data we see from the economy and the care structure. So that's one piece of work that the Economic Growth and Mobility Project is going to be engaged in this year. I'm excited to share some more about that and happy to share more as those studies come out. The next piece is going to be not so unfamiliar to all of you, but it's like, all right, if we've done this infrastructure issue, right? If we build back and address the care issues, care and access to training, or in training and education, care and getting access to work, broadband internet, we still have to talk about bias in hiring, right? And it's something that is not new to people here and something we've been talking about at the Philly Fed for quite some time. But how do we encourage employers to think about diversifying their talent pipelines and recovery? And other recoveries we have seen, again, that people without a college degree are lagging in the recovery. And we're going to probably see those trends exacerbated when we look at our data on automation and in terms of who has been most impacted by job loss. So we know that workers have skills that are often invisible in the labor market, and that we are often only using credentials to mark those capabilities. And so thinking about how do we bring employers around this work, particularly in this moment in time? There's a lot of conversations happening right now about fears around labor shortage and workers not coming back to work. And so how do we encourage employers to think about removing unnecessary degree requirements and prioritizing competency-based or skills-based assessments? And again, I think Keith will talk about this more as his research speaks to it, but I want to talk about one kind of overarching piece of that. And that is how we change our narratives around our workers. We often speak about job seekers and deficit language, right? Low skill, I will probably say I'm guilty of this as well. It's something that we're all starting to challenge, right? When we reflect back on those jobs that we're automating, you think about what a teller did and the amount of knowledge they have, both quantitative capacity as well as communication skills, organizational skills, critical thinking, ability to work with technological platforms. Those are all high demand skills right now. And so how do we reframe those jobs that may have been low wage jobs, but aren't necessarily low skilled jobs? And unfortunately, those narratives inform a lot of our public policy decisions. And so really what we want to encourage as we think about equitable workforce recovery is how to frame our people as our greatest asset. Collectively, we know that this is important, right? That research that I shared earlier, that I think he shared in the chat from the San Francisco Fed, to make understand that our people are our greatest asset, and that collectively we have to invest in that asset to build a resilient and inclusive future. And so I think that's my challenge to all of you today, is what work can we do in helping to collectively change those narratives around low wage work or workers most impacted by this pandemic, understanding that they aren't necessarily low skilled workers. And how do we then inform how we hire and think about skills for them in the future? So I'll close with our final thing, and that kind of, these all lead together to Keith's presentation here, which is finally about, not just connecting people to that job, but fostering pathways to mobility. And so really, how do we think about shifting our resources to invest in career pathways, both inside and outside of work? So the first here, really, we've seen from Keith's research, he's going to talk about the degree of similarity between skills required in low wage work and higher wage work. So again, thinking about those jobs that are automating, cashiers, for example, and the kinds of competencies that those workers already have. I think for me, what is an opportunity here are new kinds of partnerships, really thinking about how private and public institutions can work together to reduce risk and potentially reduce costs to workers, both of their time and dollars, and getting training for those kinds of transitions. It also may mean employers rethinking how they reskill and upskill their current workers. So rather than automating those jobs or laying people off, how do you think about building those career paths? So I'm excited to hear more about this work from Keith. I will also plug, we have a book that is coming up. The launch event is June 3rd. So if anybody is interested, the book is called Workforce Realigned, and it is a partnership between the Philadelphia Fed, the Atlanta Fed, and social finance. And it is also about those innovative partnerships, particularly around financing and how we pay for and finance training and education for workers. So if you're interested in any of these things about shifting risk, I'm happy to share more about that, but mostly excited to turn it over to my colleague Keith to talk about his research and really how it connects to these conversations about skills and fostering economic mobility. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. I really appreciate it. I think that was an amazing overview of what an equitable workforce recovery looks like. I'm going to pick up on a couple of threads that you alluded to, in particular the career pathways and the bias in hiring. So let me share my screen. Is that coming through okay?
Yes, we see it.
Great, thank you. All right, so like Ashley, I will start off with the standard Fed disclaimer, and that is that my views are not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. So on the next slide, I'm going to explain why we undertook a study on occupational mobility. Ashley referred to it a couple of times. I do want to mention that this work is a collaborative effort with Kyle Fee at the Cleveland Fed and Kyle DeMaria in Philadelphia. But here's where the work began. So in 2019, some colleagues and I did some research on the non-college labor force. We wanted to gain a better understanding of the types of jobs and sort of the share of the overall economy that was accessible to a non-college worker and that paid a decent wage. And so we coined the term opportunity employment, and we defined it as work that's accessible to someone without a bachelor's degree and that pays above the national annual median wage of around $38,000, adjusted up or down for the cost of living. And we found that around 22% of all jobs met that definition. And we also learned that, interestingly, that some of the largest opportunity occupations, including those in healthcare and the skilled trades, so registered nurses, licensed practical nurses, carpenters, plumbers, they're expected to experience above average growth in the coming years, in spite of the automation that Ashley was describing. And so that gave us a better sense of the landscape of economic opportunity that a non-college worker could expect to find. But we didn't want to stop there. We know that some workers get stuck in lower wage jobs. We know that lower wage jobs outnumber these opportunity occupations. And so the next natural question for us to ask was, how can we create pathways into these better paying jobs for workers without a college degree? And then how can workers leverage the skills they've gained through other employment, through prior work experience, to advance to these higher paying careers? I'm going to ask you to remember or to appreciate that we started this work at the end of 2019, back when unemployment was at 3.5%. And we know, as Ashley described, that we're in a very different economy. We're short roughly 8 million jobs from the peak. But we think this research is important now for new reasons. So in addition to the fact that millions are out of work, surveys have suggested that quite a few people are taking this opportunity to consider changing fields. So many people appreciate that their jobs may not be coming back. They may have concerns around exposure to the coronavirus or any other health concerns in the workplace. I heard from a survey last week that 1 in 5 workers during the COVID-19 pandemic has changed occupations. Not changed jobs, but changed occupations. So 20% of workers have changed what they do for a living. And what I hope is that the research that I'm about to describe can help folks, especially those with lower levels of formal education, see what opportunities are out there for them if they can leverage those skills that they've gained. So on this slide, I'm going to talk for just a second about sort of our guiding principles. And the first is that at its core, an occupation, your job, my job, it's really just a collection or a bundle of tasks that we have to complete each day. And what really differentiates my job from yours are the skills that I need to do my task and the skills that you need to do yours. And with that in mind, we analyzed tens of millions of online job advertisements in the 33 largest metros, and we focused on the 25 skills that were most requested by employers in these job advertisements. And we got specific. So which 25 skills were most often requested by employers for a specific occupation in one of these largest labor markets? And the approach, the research that I'm about to present, the approach that we took kind of hinges on the notion that these 25 skills can be used to define an occupation. And so what we did was we compared these skill sets for every lower wage job and every opportunity occupation in these metros, and we focused on what we call potential transitions. So these are transitions from one job to another that would produce at least a 10% pay increase and not require a bachelor's degree. And then we did a little bit of fancy math. We calculated what's called a similarity score, a cosine similarity score, and it measures the degree to which a pair of occupations requires a similar set of skills at a similar rate. And the score ranges from 0 to 1. The higher the score, the more similar the required skill sets are. And for all of these potential transitions, any pair that has a score over 0.75, we call a top transition. So I think what you're going to see on the next slide is that, and one of the first things we noticed is that there's a really high degree of similarity between the skills requested for lower wage and for opportunity occupations. This table shows the 20 most requested skills between 2014 and 2018 across the US. The overall intensity column, what that percentage means is that's just the share of job ads that requested a skill. And these are ranked from 1 to 20. And then in the columns on the right, you can see that I've ranked these skills for lower wage jobs and for opportunity occupations. And any skill ranking in the top 10 is shaded dark orange. And I hope that the first thing that pops out to you is that the first 6 skills are top 10 in both sets of jobs. And if you look at these skills, these are what some people call soft skills. Some people call them 21st century skills, but they're skills like communication, customer service, organization, teamwork, collaboration. So these are skills that aren't just transferable from one job to another, but our research shows that they're transferable from one set of lower paying jobs to another set of better paying jobs. And you can see, the title on this chart. Oftentimes we hear about a skills gap, but to me, this is evidence that skills can be used as a bridge. Now, of course, nobody works in the overall labor market, right? This table sort of describes the national economy. And when we look at specific pairs of jobs, we do see some differences. And you would expect that, right? You wouldn't expect the skills listed for a carpenter to have a lot of overlap with the skills listed for a registered nurse. But as you'll see on the next slide, we do find what we call top transitions in every metro. And here's an example. So on this chart, what I'm showing are the 25 skills requested for sales representatives of services in Phoenix, and how they compare to the skills required for retail salespersons in Phoenix. And of course, retail salespersons earn less. You can see in the call-out box what their wages are. And if a retail salesperson could be hired to be a sales representative, they could see a wage increase of around 128%. But let's pick apart the skills that are needed. So if a skill is shown in blue, what that means is that it's required for both of these occupations. And you can see there's a lot of blue on this chart, especially at the top. So the most important skills like sales, customer service, communication, teamwork, product sales, these are required for both occupations. Now the skills shown in orange are required only for the better paying sales rep job. And you could think about the orange skills as identifying opportunities for training. Training that if a retail salesperson could gain these skills would allow them to more easily transition to a better paying sales rep job. And because there's so much similarity in these skill sets, you can see that the similarity score in this call out box is a very high 0.86. Now we find, this is just one example in Phoenix, but across the 33 metros we study, we find nearly 4,100 examples like this one. And what I think is even more encouraging is that roughly half of lower wage employment can be paired with a top transition like this one. Now I'll ask you to look at the top bar on this chart. And what it shows is that in some cases, these transitions are from low wage jobs to better paying opportunity occupations. So you would see a pretty large increase in pay for those types of transitions. But in other cases, they're simply to a better paying lower wage job, but one that pays at least 10% more. And I think most of us would take a 10% pay raise, right? Now, in order to be classified as a top transition, the 10% is a minimum. So a pair of jobs would have to produce at least a 10% pay increase, but throughout the study, we find much more substantial wage gains. If you look at the bottom row on this table, what you'll see is that across these 4,100 top transitions, we find if they're actualized by workers, they would represent an increase in average annual median wages of around 49%, from $30,000 to about $45,000. So an increase of almost half in wages. And the second row on the table shows that for workers who could transition from lower wage jobs to these better paying opportunity occupations, you could see a relative wage gain of almost 78%. So on my last slide, what I'm going to do is highlight a couple of strategies that I think can improve economic mobility for workers, but also help meet the needs of employers. And the first that I actually alluded to is skills-based hiring. So this is a practice that could expand applicant pools to include workers who don't have a bachelor's degree, but who have the skills needed to do the job. Now, I think in order for this to work, there needs to be appreciation on both sides of the hiring process for workers and for employers that skills are portable. And I think that workers generally understand this, and I think employers are a little, not that they don't understand it, but I think it's more difficult to identify the skills they need, to assess applicants for those skills, and then to make hiring decisions based on those skills. It might require them to rethink their processes, maybe to minimize the necessity for formal credentials like a 4-year degree, and to focus on the skills that are actually required for the job. Now, I've talked about skill similarity and occupational similarity, but I've never suggested that these pairs of occupations are identical. So targeted training could provide otherwise qualified workers with the skills they need to make a transition. So if you think about those orange skills on the chart, targeted training could help workers gain those skills, shade those skills blue, and make that worker even more successful in the transition they're about to embark. And then whether that training happens in-house at employers, at a community college, or elsewhere, collaboration, which is one of the soft skills that we talked about, between employers, education providers, and workforce development organizations will be important to make sure that the training is going to meet local demand. So our web team created a tool. It's called the Occupational Mobility Explorer. I'm going to demonstrate that now. I mentioned there are 4,100 top transitions, and we wrote a 30-page report, so we couldn't include all the information we wanted to share. I'm going to walk through the tool. And Ashley, if you could drop a link to the tool in the chat, I would appreciate that if you haven't already. So the tool, you'll see me looking off camera. I'm looking at a second screen to do this demonstration. The tool has 3 tabs: build your path, compare skills, and do top transitions. And we'll spend most of our time on the build your path tab. Now, I mentioned there are 33 different metro areas covered in the research. Let's start in Phoenix. We'll start with helpers of installation, maintenance, and repair. So it's like an assistant position for maintenance workers. When you click Start Path, you'll see some information here. So that the occupation you've chosen is called the origin occupation, and you'll see information on the number of jobs, the annual median wages, our classification for that occupation, and then the national growth rate. Then you'll see 10 occupations listed in the first destination column. And these 10 occupations are the ones that have the highest similarity score with the origin that you selected. And you'll see some comparable information: jobs, wages. You also see the wage increase, so the increase in wages from the origin to the destination. And then that similarity score that I mentioned. You can see that this first option, maintenance and repair workers, probably not overly surprising that a helper of maintenance and repair workers would have a very high skill overlap with the full-fledged maintenance and repair workers, right? A score of 0.89. So we'll add that one to the path. Again, not surprising. Oops. Go back one. Oh my goodness. Sorry about that. Let me just start over quickly. All right. We hadn't gotten too far down the path. So I add that back to the path. And then I'm going to select industrial machinery mechanics, the third option in our second destination, right? So this list of occupations, it shows the 10 that are most similar to the first destination. So it's an iterative process that lets workers consider how they can build skills in one position and apply them in the next. So we'll choose industrial machinery mechanics. And then we go out 4 steps just for space constraints. And we make it to industrial engineering technicians or aircraft mechanics, both with similarity scores above the 0.75. And you can see that if a worker began at a $31,000 salary, they could, by spending time, by learning skills, by pursuing some additional education, could take a few steps to a career paying in roughly $60,000. So I'm going to start a new path. We're going to go to Philadelphia, a place near and dear to me and Ashley. And here we're going to pick cashiers. So this is a larger and lower wage job in the service sector in Philadelphia. Roughly 70,000 jobs. The occupation at the top has a score of 0.75. Customer service representative has just about as many jobs, 62,000 jobs. We'll add that one to the path. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit. You see there are a number of occupations with high similarity scores at the top, but I'm going to choose securities, commodities, and financial services sales agents. You know them as stockbrokers or investment advisors. I'll add them to the path. And then at the top, you see it's not quite at the 0.75 cutoff that we use at 0.7 first line supervisors of non-retail sales workers. Now I chose these last two because they're a little bit less intuitive, and I think they demonstrate that in order for a customer service representative to move along this path, they may need some additional education or some experience spent in, say, non-retail sales in order to become a supervisor. It's not to suggest that these transitions can happen overnight, but they're transitions that could lead a worker from $15,000 a year to $90,000 a year, and a transition that wouldn't require a 4-year degree. All right, I'm going to try one more path. I'm going to go to Dallas here. In Dallas, I'm going to select the white collar occupation. So the first was more of a manual labor or blue collar occupation, and then an occupation in the service sector. I'll choose bill and account collectors. And I'll go through this more quickly because I think you probably get the gist now. We can add credit counselors to the path, office supervisors, and then a couple of managerial positions, again, paying $90,000 to $120,000, all based on the similarity in skills from one occupation to the next along this pathway. Now, you've probably seen that there's a compare skills option in this tab. And you can compare the skills on the fly here for a given set of occupations. But we do have a second tab, and I'll go back to Dallas and bill and account collectors, credit counselors. And this screen allows you to get a larger view of these skill sets. And you can see skills that are required for both occupations are grouped at the top. You can see a ton of overlap. Of course, there was a very high similarity score for this pair of occupations. And as you scroll down, just like on the chart that I showed in my presentation, skills that are required for the second job that aren't required in the first are shaded orange. And again, you might think of these as sort of training opportunities. And the last tab that I'll show quickly is our View Top Transitions tab. And here, you can look at all of the top transitions we identified in our study by each metro area. You can sort by wages. You can look at the similarity scores and the wage increase. You can look at all 4,100 if you're so inclined, and then also download them in an Excel spreadsheet. So that concludes my presentation. Janae, I think we left the 10 minutes that you requested for Q&A. But thank you for your time, and I look forward to the next 10 minutes.
Yeah, I love that last resource. So if you'll chat, share, whatever, I will send an email out to all the group with all these resources, your deck, etc. Darn, John Boudreau has to drop off, and he's got tons of great comments. It's great that you were there, John, and I will also be recording some of your questions, and perhaps Ashley and Keith can answer those. John is a HR guru that does a lot of publications as well, so I know he's super interested. Does anybody else have questions? Let's see, let me go down here. Excellent, very helpful. Yeah, I agree, Luther. What's the best way, Terry Burgess, for people to educate themselves on the occupation, on that Explorer tool?
It's a good question. So as we rolled this out in December, and I would say that over the last 5 months, we've either presented on a webinar like this or just given sort of a personalized demonstration of the tool, I'd say roughly once a week. And I think we've found audiences that we didn't expect. So I think initially we were thinking of the tool as a resource for workers, right? For workers who are thinking about making a transition either in a tight labor market or in a looser one like we've experienced more recently. But we found that the audience is much more varied. So we've given presentations to folks who think that we should get this in front of guidance counselors, right? That students in high school, potentially in community colleges, who are working in a low wage job might feel optimistic about the work that they're doing because they can see how the skill that they're developing could be used down the road. We do think that community colleges could help use this information to train workers who have been laid off in a hard-hit industry, think about how they can transition to jobs that are more in demand. I think that employers could use this tool as a resource because it might bring to light some skill similarities, some skill overlaps that are sort of hidden below the surface that aren't as intuitive. When I started this research, I wouldn't have told you that a customer service rep and a stockbroker or investment advisor would need similar skill sets. But I think the research indicates this and the tool indicates this. We're happy to make presentations like these. I'm not speaking for Ashley here, but for my research, my co-authors and I, Coffee and Cobbly and Marina, we're happy to make presentations like these to interested groups because we want to make sure it's used as much as it can.
Well, ClosedED's going to be in October in Santa Fe, so you'll have to come and do a real demo. So, Luther, let's see, Holly, thank you. Let's see, I think I saw. Will you be adding cities, particularly New Orleans? Lauren King's asking.
So that is the most frequently asked question that we receive, and our response is, we just released this in December. We do plan to update the tool, and when we do, we will more than likely add other metros. We wanted this first round to allow us to talk about skills that were specific to metropolitan areas. We know jobs are different. Jobs are different depending on how industries are clustered. You might need one set of skills as an IT support specialist in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and a different set in Silicon Valley, right? So we wanted the skills to be specific to the labor market we were working in. But having said that, it restricted us to the 33 largest. And I think what we're going to do in any update is expand it to smaller places, but just recognize that we have to use sort of national skill profiles instead of skill profiles that are specific to smaller places.
Okay, Joanna Gibson said, how many higher ed schools are aware of using this tool? Probably after the pandemic, not many.
I'm sorry, so how many?
Higher education. I think, Joanna, that's your question. HE schools, so higher education. Like it does seem like an incredible workforce tool for higher ed.
Thank you. Yeah, we're doing all we can to raise to elevate the profile of the tool. Like I said, we're giving presentations as we can. Jimmy, I'm not sure if you or your audience are familiar with the Education Design Labs Community College Growth Engine Fund.
Totally. I think most people are. Yeah.
I would imagine so. So we were the research collaborator with that, and so we were working closely with 6 community colleges to explain to them the opportunity occupations in the region, to think about skill overlap and skill similarity.
Well, I think CNM and Albuquerque was one of those, weren't they? I don't know.
Caldi Maria was our point person.
Okay. Okay, good. Higher ed institutions, yeah. Let's see. Ken Sorey, have you talked with employers about using these skill profiles to revamp their job postings and screening methods to align with skills that may be barriers and necessary skills?
I saw Ashley unmute yourself. I will just say that employers are probably the hardest, the most difficult sector for us to penetrate. It's easier for us to get in front of workforce development organizations, community colleges, than it is for employers. Before I turn over to Ashley here, I will say that if we could find an employer who would be willing to work with us to think about a research project that would allow us to sort of test what the effects are on their hiring processes and on their productivity and on their satisfaction with their hires using a skills-based framework as opposed to a traditional sort of formal credential framework, we'd be eager to do that. So if anyone has any ideas, please let us know.
I have some ideas for sure.
Great.
So we'll get back with that. Quick question: are you working with the Business Roundtable, Dane Lynn?
Yeah, so I was going to say I'll answer a little bit on how we're engaging with employers on this. Yeah. So part of our Research and Action Lab last year in Philadelphia was on the future of work. And we helped, now our Chamber of Commerce has launched an initiative where they're really looking at investing in skills, both in upskilling and reskilling, and also how they as a chamber try to get more people involved in skills-based hiring. I mean, I think one of the things they've struggled through, to be quite honest, is you have a whole broad set of industry sectors and huge organizations with a lot of capacity and very small organizations as well. And so they've been trying to think through, well, what does it mean for more people to engage in this? How do we measure that more people have engaged in it? And how do we continue to kind of champion the importance of that work? So that's something we've been really excited to be involved in, but I'm kind of waiting to see how they actually continue to roll that out. I think we have more largely engaged in sort of some of the national conversations around this with our colleagues across the system and workforce development, and particularly around this kind of inclusive recovery conversation. So I know the Business Roundtable has been a big champion, and we're excited about the letter that came out in 2020. Yeah, as we're trying to see, we had a conference last year that Jabay participated, last year, 2 years ago now. That I was going to say Jabay participated in, where we were trying to elevate companies that are doing this well. And I think our challenge here is a lot of the work we do in the Philadelphia Fed is regional. And so we're trying to figure out how do we take what maybe some very large national employers are starting to embrace and try to regionalize it. And I'll say one of our biggest champions here is Accenture. They have been huge proponents of skills-based hiring and helping to lead that conversation with the chamber. And I think they're, really encouraging other employers to do this. But for many, if you're a small manufacturing firm, for a lot of those smaller firms, they're trying to understand how to operate some of this. And so employer who would open their doors in terms of data and show us what the impacts are, because I do think we have enough data to show who's being excluded, right? Philly, it's like 70% of our workforce doesn't have a four-year college degree. And so, we have a really good need case, and I'm sure a lot of you listening today have the need case. But I think there's still a larger conversation on what is the best practice for implementing? And I will say there's a couple of coalitions I sit on in Philly where people are really trying to do that. And I'm hopeful that will have a huge impact on our city in terms of recovery.
Okay, and Holly mentioned 110 Coalition. Holly.
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm going to end on time. This was amazing. We'll send out all the information to attendees as well as links, etc. And then we'll get the recording posted for the entire community. We'll be in touch. Right now, we do have Dane Lynn scheduled to speak on the 25th. I'm going to check with him and see if he's comfortable, because that's I just want to check in with him on the time. But it will be interesting to hear the progress Dane's having with those 90+ companies that say they want to shift to skills. And I know that survey is happening right now, etc. Yes, we will send out the presentation slides. I believe you guys are willing to share those with me. Okay, awesome. You guys are this was way more informative than I even thought it would be. So thank you both so very much for taking the time to share this.
Thank you, Jabay.
Okay, bye.
Good evening, everyone.